Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's weekly Rashi study class.
Fifth chapter of the book of Shemot, Exodus, initial encounter between Moshe and Aaron and Paro. What we talked about last time through Rashi was the question of where the Zikanim, the elders, were. Originally, God had commanded Moshe to bring the elders with him to Pharaoh, and we read this midrash that suggested that they basically were afraid, and they slinked away on the way to the palace, on the way to the Palatin, and that this was that sin of fear was paid back to them, or they had to pay for it, and that they were not invited up onto the mountain later on after the giving of the Ten Commandments. It's interesting to note, we didn't talk about this last time, that both in the text of the Torah and in the Midrash, there seems to be a lot of weight given to not having faith that God will take care of you, right? The big sin of the Meraglim, of the scouts, is that they were awed by what they saw in the land of Israel, and they didn't have sufficient faith, according to the Torah, that God would be able to see them through it. And they were punished pretty severely, much more severely than the Zikanim were punished here. They were not given the opportunity to enter the land of Israel, right? So they died off before the wanderings completed. So it's an interesting sub-theme in the Torah's narrative and theology and rabbinic narrative theology. It's not inappropriate to recognize that circumstances are hard, but it might be theologically inappropriate for the rabbis to posit that God doesn't have the wherewithal to get you through what is hard, right? And those are two different stances on life. So we could both identify with the Zikanim saying, I'm not sure we should be going in front of Pharaoh unbidden to make this request. And we can understand the Midrash's thrust saying there are moments for you to have faith that God will lead you through the wilderness figuratively and literally. I believe that we read verse 3, but didn't do the Rashi. So let me read verse 3 again to get us moving, and then we'll call on someone to read the Rashi. Unless anyone has anything else. I know we already got to verse 3 last time, but anything lingering on verse 2 I want to add? Okay. Vayomeru Elohei Avrim Mikra Aleinu. They said, Aaron and Moshe, that the God of the Hebrews, and we compared this to the earlier in the Parsha, where we are told what's going to happen in the scene, where the Mikra is with a hey, which means kind of a circumstantial happenstance, and here it's a calling out. Rashi does not pay much attention to it, but it's an interesting comparison. Is this a scribal error, or is this intentional? That the God of the Hebrews was called upon us, right, appeared to us. We compared several translations and how some translators read these two words, Nikra Aleinu, the same way, whether it's an aleph or a hey, and some read it differently. Nel Chana, let us go, please, we pray. Derech Shlosha Yamim, a travel of 3 days, Bamidbar, in the wilderness. V'nizbecha l'Adonai Eloheinu, we will offer sacrifices to Adonai our God. Pein yifka einu, lest God smite pogea us, badever, with pestilence, o vacherev, or with the sword, right? So where we got to last time was mentioning the oddity that Rashi is about to spend some time on, saying, what's the penifka enu? Why is the threat to Pharaoh, or the stick for Pharaoh, hey, let us out? Because if you don't, we're going to be smitten. We, the messengers, are going to be smitten, particularly since we learned before the scene that God had said, you need to let Pharaoh know from the very beginning that his firstborn, right, ani horeg et bechorecha, that his firstborn is vulnerable. So there seems to be no sense in advance that there's a reason to hold back from Pharaoh how much is at stake for his own well-being, and yet the suffix is not lest God smite you, pein yifka acha, but rather pein yifka enu, lest God smite us. So I think that's where we ended last week, kind of trying to think about what might be a pshatish understanding of that verb, and then we'll finish that and then see what Rashi has to say and see if there's an overlap. Rick?
Hi. The new could be all of us.
Don't hear you yet, Rick.
Don't know.
But now I hear you. Sorry, that was my bad. I had my volume down. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi. The new could be all of us, not just us Jews. It could be everybody in the place, everybody in Egypt, right?
Aha. So, Nifka'enu, you're saying,
including Pharaoh in there.
The inclusive us, everyone present. On that, we could still ask a question, right? So let's say that's what it means, right? That it doesn't mean lest God smite us, the messengers, but rather lest God smite this whole land, including us. Why is that a better verb choice than pein yifga'acha or pein yifga'achem?
And why are they even bringing that up? God didn't tell them to say that. God told them to say other things, and they're not doing what God said. So, right. That's also the secondary question.
Right. Well, God, if you go back to chapter 4, verse 23, right, when God predicts the scene, but tama'in l'shalcho, he's going to refuse to send you, which Pharaoh already did in the previous verse. He said, "Who am I to listen to this God?" Here, behold, I'm going to slay your son, your firstborn. So there does seem to be an indication that they're supposed to threaten him, but even if we sharpen pein yifga'enu to mean lest God smite us to lest God smite all of us, it doesn't seem to be nearly as sharp or direct as you're the ones who are vulnerable, not us. Particularly since, I don't know, maybe Pharaoh doesn't have to know this, but I would assume it's so hard to make an assumption within a story. But how should I say this? We know later on that the plagues impact the Egyptians and not the Israelites, right? So the way the story is going to play out is that the Israelites are not vulnerable to God's wrath here. Only the Egyptians are. So why not go right to it? So it's still it's a good read that pein yifga'enu can mean not just the two of us, but all of us. But it's still Ze'omer Darsheni, still begging for an explanation. Anyone else want to offer one before we look at Rashi? Okay. Carol, do you want to read pein yifga'enu? A short little Rashi, but some interesting stuff there.
Okay. Are you hearing me okay?
Yes.
All right. Pein yifga'enu, pein yifga'echa, hayu tzrichim lomar, ella shechelko kavod lamalchut.
Okay.
Let me see. Okay, so lest he strike you, it should have said
right
to be more of a threat. But chelko kavod lamalchut, I don't get what this means. Something about honoring the kingship or honoring his throne.
Correct.
I don't want
it's an idiom to cholek kavod, which literally means to split out or divide honor, really means to bestow honor. It reminds me of the two-word phrase in yeshivish, to be melamed zchut on someone is to judge them favorably. So it literally means to teach merit upon them. But it's if you can read someone positively or negatively and read them positively, like, he's melamed zchut on that person. So to be cholek kavod is to distribute, maybe that's a better word, distribute some of the kavod, the honor that you have to offer to that person. So you had the first part exactly right. Hey, reader, Rashi says, I know that you know that it should have said, pein yifga'acha, lest God come and smite you. So why do Moshe and Aaron choose lest God smite us? Because they were distributing kavot to the kingdom. So what's the Rashi on the Rashi? What does that mean, Carol or anyone else? What's the import of this?
I mean, it sounds like they just didn't want to piss him off. Like they were just trying to, this is their first encounter. They want to kind of be a little bit honorable to him initially.
I think that's right. It's like, we're going to threaten you, but we're going to threaten you politely. You know that scene in Parshat Chayei Sarah with the back and forth between Avraham and Ephron on the birth on purchasing the cave of Machpelah, and all of these politeness. If it pleases you, but I, your servant, would never do this for you. It's like an overly polite, shook encounter, as it were, where what's actually taking place is much more harsh and economics and severe than the polite language that's being used. And in some ways, it's still part of a Middle Eastern way of doing business, right? In the shuk. And what Rashi and Chizkun and others read into this is, even in the moment where Moshe and Pharaoh are representing God, to take down a tyrant, right? It's you want to take it lightly. One of the references that I have here is in my mind is very very contemporary, and that is the fact that that Russia's emissaries are still probably spoken to rather politely at the UN, right? Zelensky gave that tremendous speech yesterday, and it was such a tragic situation, but so odd that he's addressing the Security Council, on which Russia sits permanently, about Russia's atrocities. And while he spoke without a whole lot of over politeness and holding back, right? The language of the UN is probably the language of polite speech, softer than the circumstances warrant. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. It feels like a bad thing today, although I guess that's how the world operates. But that's a version of what I see Rashi saying going on here, right? Moshe and Aaron are there representing the greatest force in the universe, but they're not going to bring down the fullness of the hammer, at least in the language, right? They know that Pharaoh knows that what they mean is you're in trouble, but they're going to do it it could get rough around here, Pharaoh, for all of us, right? So it's a cousin to what Rick was saying, right? But it's a wider explanation that we all know, Pharaoh, there's a harsher way to say what we're going to say. We're not saying it that way. Wink, wink. And then anything else to add before Carol finished the Rashi? Okay. Ufkia.
Pgia zo lashon mikra mavet hi. This use of pigia, is the language of death. I'm not trying to understand what he's trying to say here.
Right. So Rashi throws in an answer to a different question in the same comment. So if we could recreate the question to which this is an answer, it might be, and why is this verb being used anyway? Right? Like to be, to be pogeia is to injure, to hurt. It's to be wounded, right? But is that really what's going on here? Isn't the threat more severe than that? So Rashi says this use of pigia is not the softer use of a low impact risk, but the language of death. And some of the super commentators help give us some other textual references to show how this is the case. Let me share one of them with you. So, language throughout the Tanakh can be learned from one another. So this is the first book of Kings, chapter 2. The context is interesting, but not particularly significant for our circumstances. Starting with verse 30, Vayavo v'nayu el ohel Adonai, Benaiah went to the tent of God, Vayomer elav, and he said to him, Ko amar hamelech, this is what the king said, Say, come out from where you've been hiding, Vayomer lo, he said, no, kifo amut, I'm going to die here. Vayashev Benayu et Hamelech, Benaiah brought this back to the king, Davar Lemor, saying, Ko diber Yoav v'cho anani, this is how Yoav, the person who was hiding, responded, and this is what he said. And now verse 31, Vayomer lo Hamelech, this is what the king said, Aseh kasher diber, do just as he said, ufagabo ukvarto. So pogea him and bury him, right? So the inference is that whatever's happening in the pogea verb is ending up in death, unless we want to think of this as a ghastly burying alive, right? So here is a a close association between a root which normally means something softer, but here is you go from pigiyah to the grave. The commentator said that's what Rashi meant in our verse, right? Sometimes pigiyah means something harsher than just a wound or a bumping up against. Okay, right, like in the Yaakov story, by Yifgah b'makom, right, that he bumped into that place. Pega can just be like a this, but sometimes it can be a this. Barry?
So playing out this stage play here, so these two slaves are coming to Pharaoh, and they're worried that they're going to get killed by their God if they don't get to go. What does Pharaoh care about this?
Right, and Pharaoh already said in the previous verse, who is this God and who are you? Right, so we're at the very beginning of this waltz. Interesting, you referenced them as these two slaves come to Pharaoh. I'm not sure if we're going to get to it today, but one of the Rashis in the next verse is going to play with the question of what Moshe and Aaron's status actually is with respect to Pharaoh and with respect to slavery itself. But whether they're slaves or not, they're not members of the royal court, and they came in unbidden without the golden scepter being, extended to them. To borrow a Purim analogy, why should it bother Pharaoh whatsoever? Larry, Diane?
So I just want us to point out the difference between Dever and Cherev, because theologically, here in this sentence they're put into the same category. If we could be punished by pestilence, which we clearly understand as something coming from nature, and sword, which we clearly understand as something coming from others. Whereas I guess in the biblical narrative, the sword against us is turned into God avenging or whatever. So
good. So first of all, good to raise the question of why those two nouns are there, and is it a doubling of an image for pure emphasis, or do they represent different things? I forgot to mention as we're going through the translation of the verse that Onkelos translates this very oddly, because Dever and Cherev are very specific Hebrew words, right? Dever does mean pestilence. We're gonna see it in just a few days, right? It's one of the things we're gonna do this for. And Cherev is a sword. So you're reading it on the axis of one is representing calamity that comes through nature, and one is representing calamity that comes through the might of a human being. Onkelos denudes it of its specificity. If you look over at Onkelos, if you have it, I guess I should start getting Onkelos up on the screen so that everyone can look at it in case any of you are working from a text that doesn't have it. I didn't do that right before class today. All right, so start with the beginning. V'amaru, and they said, Elaha de Yehudae. Once again, we have this interesting, the God of the Jews. That's an anachronism. Itgele alana, revealed God's self to us. Nezel, let us go. Ka'an mahalach tlata yomin. We will go 3 days. Tlata is shalosh. Aramaic taf is a Hebrew shin in some cases. Bamidbara, into the desert. Unedbach kadam Adonai. We will slaughter in front of God. Also, Aramaic Zion is a Hebrew. Aramaic Dalet is Hebrew Zion. So nidbach is like zavach. Kadam Adonai elahana, in front of God and our God. Dilma yi'ar inana, lest God do bad things to us, b'mota o v'ktol, either with death or with murder. It's a very interesting choice, which I gotta say I don't understand, and I didn't look at the commentary to Onkelos here, because however we, looking at the Hebrew, would distinguish between Dever or Cherev, it doesn't seem to be, it doesn't seem to be representing generic ideas, but specific ideas. The only thing I can think of is that mota, maybe it's connected to what you were saying, Danny. Mota is the death that comes from the environment, whereas with katol, murder is the death that comes through a sword. But there are Aramaic words for pestilence and sword, so it's an interesting choice. I'd be curious to know if anybody of the translations translate this into English with words that other than pestilence or sword. Everett Fox does pestilence and sword. Larry, I saw your hand up for something else. Do you want to read us either the translations you have?
Sure, I'll tell you. The Kaplan has plague or sword.
Plague or sword, okay.
Altar has, next page, sorry, 3. Pestilence or sword.
Pestilence or sword. I don't have my Etz Chaim in front of me, so I don't have the JPS. If someone wants to read how the JPS translates it, I'd be curious to hear that.
JPS is pestilence or sword.
Pestilence or sword.
Saperstein also is pestilence or sword.
Which
plague or sword. Plague or sword.
Which is what makes sense. So it's an unresolved question for me why Onkelos translates it that way. Larry, your hand was up for something else too?
Yeah.
And then Tova.
A different question. And I'm going to credit Ibn Ezra here, though I don't understand the entirety of the Ibn Ezra thing. He starts off by saying, "Kolelet anachnu Yisraelim." So he thinks that lest we Yifka'enu is only either Moses or Aaron, or Moses, Aaron, and the Israelites. He then says, "Gam ata Pharaoh, imanu v'chol hamitzrim." It also includes you and all Egyptians. So I'm not going to go into a long discourse on pronouns. We all know the problem in English about the plural versus singular you, which we lack the y'all. But we also lack, and I don't know if any language has, a distinction between us, just us, or us, all of us, including you.
Uh-huh.
And so this us could also be, according to Ibn Ezra, that God's going to smite all of us, everybody here, because we haven't done what it is that he required.
Right, which I think is what Rick was kind of hinting at, right? That the Pen Yifka'enu means not that God is going to kill us and that we have failed in our mission to convince you, but God is going to bring unrelenting and undiscriminating catastrophe to all of us, right? So I pulled up the Ibn Ezra that you were quoting, Kolelat anachnu Yisraelim, including us, Gam ata Paro imanu v'chol mitzrim. All of us together are going to be subject to God's wrath here. Yeah. I think, in some ways, I think that the Rick, Larry, Ibn Ezra approach is probably closer to Pshat than the Rashi approach, because it just seems odd, even though we explained it well before, it seems odd for this to be a moment of politeness. And maybe this is just that the language that was used was a collective us that includes you, right? But it's definitely a verb that jumps out and says, gosh, there's got to be a reason why it was done this way. Good. Tova, and then Renee's hand went down. I guess you contributed, and then Rick.
Well, my initial point was exactly the point that Diane made, so I'll just add one more thing to that the use of cherev, a dever, as Diane, I think, said, is something that's visited on you as nature or the kind of punishment that God said, whereas cherev is usually at the hands of other human beings, and it just resonates for me in Pharaoh's later expressed concern, lest they rise against us. That is, lest the people of Israel rise against us, so that cherev has that notion of either attack by the Israelites against the Egyptians or just civil war where we're all fighting one another. And so it sort of foreshadows that fear that Pharaoh is going to express.
Great. And if you combine what you said, Tova, to what Diane said, I'm still not sure why Onkelos went that way, but I suppose now his Mota and Katol are making more sense to me.
Right.
And that Mota is you're dying from something you didn't expect to die from, right? Could be dever, and Katol is that you were murdered, and that's what happens when you're killed with a sword. Why he turned it into a generic category, I don't know. But at least those the categories he turned them into make a little more sense. So I appreciate both of your comments. Thank you. Rick, and then Rebecca Leonard.
So I'm not sure if we brought it up yet, but of all the things that you could appeal to Ramses about, appealing to the danger of this group of people not worshiping their God right and then being punished, well, he'll lose his slave labor force. So he's not going to be impressed by anything ethical, but if it hurts him in his pocket, if he loses part of his labor force because they're not worshiping their God right, then that's I think it's a subtle appeal to his greed of preserving his wealth, kind of thing.
That's an interesting comment, Rick. It's
Thank you.
Basically reading this line as a double feint, a double prevarication, because they're not going out to sacrifice in order to come back, and the Israelites, not the ones who are threatened. But I hear you reading it as saying, "Hey, Pharaoh, let us out because all we want to do is sacrifice and then come back and continue to be your slaves. And if you don't let us, God's going to smite us, in which case you're not going to have us, forget about 3 days. You're not going to have us in perpetuity." So it's an attack directly at Pharaoh's bank account, but through a double lie, right? Because neither of those things are part of the plan. But that's an interesting way of weaving them together. Rebecca Leonard?
Okay.
So the word dever does indeed mean plague and pestilence, but if you look at the cognates in other Semitic languages, you get some interesting stuff.
Okay.
In both Ugaritic and Arabic, it cognates to a word meaning death, and in Akkadian, calamity.
Wow. So are you positing that maybe Onkelos thought that this dever didn't mean pestilence, it just meant potentially death?
Well, I mean, that could explain how he's interpreting it as, what did he say, motu, whatever, as death over there, because he's familiar with the word in some other languages that mean death.
Yeah. So let's see what BDB says about this. You were looking at not BDB, but your dictionary, Leonard?
Yeah, Klein.
Yeah. So here, Dever, we have pestilence, but above it, there's an Arabic cognate that means just perish, or just pass away, or death. So that's interesting. Yeah, I wonder if we could play the same game with cherev. If cherev ever means something generic rather than specific. Let's see what BDB. I never even thought to look at that. 1 second. Let's see. Got it together.
No, the cognates for cherev all mean lance or sword or spear.
Yeah. Although, right there, lahachriv means to destroy. Right, the chorban by Sheni is the destruction of the second temple, not necessarily by sword. Now, I think the reason why it means to destroy is because it comes from the root that means cherev. But it's possible that there is a notion of chet reish bet that just means a destruction as opposed to a destruction by sword. Let's see what the next. Oops. Okay. Good enough. Okay, great. We're going to the next verse. Maybe we'll get to that one that I said before about the status of Moshe and Aaron qua slaves. Okay. Whom have we not heard from today? Sue, do you want to read verse 4?
Yep. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. Vayomer. We're verse 4 in the text, right? We're not.
Correct.
Yeah.
Vayomer alehem.
Vayomer alehem melech Mitzrayim. Lama Moshe v'Aaron tafriu et ha'am mima'asav. Lechu lesivlotechem. Okay, and Vayomer alehem melech Mitzrayim, and the king of Egypt said to them, Why Moses and Aaron?
Good.
Why are tafriu? Why are you separating? Why are you separating the people from their work?
Good. So I'll just pause you right there. You're translating well in context, even though that's not really how a Hebrew speaker uses the word lahafriya in modern Hebrew, right? Lahafriya means to bother. Right? Atamafriya is you're bothering me, right? That's lahafriya with a lamed. So, but But it seems to be that since the end of the phrase is from their work, what Pharaoh should be concerned with is, why are you blanking the people from their work? It wouldn't be bothering them from the work. It would be the opposite. It would be getting in the way. So we'll look into the etymology there, but I think in context, that's probably a good translation. And then
lechu l'sivlotechem. I think that, go to your burden, go to your regular suffering.
Go to your regular suffering. Tell me what you mean by that. Because this is directed from Aaron, from God.
From Pharaoh. From Pharaoh to Moshe and Aaron.
Okay, so what does it mean, go to your regular suffering?
I think it's go back to work. I think it's, what are you doing? Why are you here? Go back to work. Go back to make the bricks. What the heck are you up to here?
Right, and in the context of the Exodus story and the Haggadah, Sivlot Mitzrayim refers to the sufferings of the Israelites in Egypt. We discussed that before, because Sivlot Mitzrayim could mean two things, right? It could mean the sufferings of Egypt, meaning as if Egypt were suffering, but it doesn't. It means the sufferings that we experienced in Egypt, right? That's what the root Samech Bet Lamed means, to suffer. It also interestingly means to tolerate in modern Hebrew. It's really interesting how those two roots got connected, because that's what tolerating is, right? Tolerating, we don't think of it as, but tolerating is enduring something which is extremely unpleasant. If it weren't unpleasant, you wouldn't have to tolerate it. But in modern Hebrew,
it's like saying you're insufferable. You're intolerable.
That's very good. Very good. I never conveyed that connection in English. Insufferable and intolerable. Good. Okay. Let me just ask, I see some of the notes in the comments. Let me just ask all of you on the pshat, what's your sense of tafriyu? And going back to something that Barry said before, what's the simple or not simple way of understanding Pharaoh saying to Moses and Aaron, go to your burdens, go to your sufferings? Uncleish translates it as go to your workings. Azilu lefalchan chon. Falchan in Aramaic can mean both worship and work, just like avodah in Hebrew can mean worship and work. It's clearly not going back to your worship. Go to your obligations. What do you think this means, Rick?
Hi. So I wanted to ask about the verb tafriyu, because I see the fe and the resh and the ayin there, just like pharaoh. So let me just say, verse 1, we have paro. We have verse 2, we have paro. Then here in verse 4, he's melech Mitzrayim. He's not paro there. But then in verse 5, we have paro again. And verse 6, we have paro again. So the narrative deliberately chose to call him melech Mitzrayim there to bring out, why isn't he called pharaoh there? And here we have tafriyu. I just think it's a fun play on the word, on the root, maybe. I don't know. It's
a wonderful pickup. And as we look at the Rashi in this, I'll show you another place in the Tanakh where I think it's a linguistic playfulness. I think you're right. With the Hebrew root, pei resh ayin, and the word name / paro, right? And pei resh ayin, as we'll see, is a root that means lots of different things. It's first of all, pei resh verbs are all in the same category. Lefaret, lefaresh, lefarek, lefareya. They all have to do with like breaking apart and distinguishing and separating. And even within that, pei resh ayin can mean lots of different things. And it also happens to be like it's an interesting question as to whether or not the word paro, and I don't know this, maybe some of you do, is that a Hebrew word for an Egyptian king, or is it the Torah's?
Tova knows.
I'm sure Torah does, right? Let me just lay out the question. Or is it like an Egyptian word that we borrowed, right? What is it a Hebrew etymology or not? Tova, what do you know?
It's absolutely an Egyptian word. It comes from the Egyptian pair A'a, which means great house. It wasn't used to refer to the king of Egypt until the New Kingdom, until the 18th dynasty. It's kind of like saying the White House announced, the pair Aha, the great house announced. So it's absolutely an Egyptian word.
Which makes then the textual playfulness of how paro gets rendered in Hebrew, and then the verb form para, really interesting, right? So just to make sure everyone's really following what Rick is saying, in the verses before and after verse 4, the guy is referenced by the name paro. In our verse, it's Melech Mitzrayim, but we have the root of paro, if it were a Hebrew root, in the verse, right? Good.
He's the great botherer. He's the great disturber.
Yes, right. So why should you disturb the people? Why should you pharaoh the people from their work? Right, is a way we could almost translate it with an intentional pun. Renee?
So Everett Fox says, would you let the people loose from their tasks? It's not quite as harsh as the other.
Oh, we lost you, Renee. We lost you halfway through your comment.
He does send them back to their burdens. So it wasn't as harsh of to have them loose from their tasks.
Right. So when Everett Fox translates tafriyu as let the people loose, he's trying to be really, really careful about what the root pei resh ayin actually means, and we'll go into that more in a second. And yes, he translates sivlotechem to your burdens, but it's a translation that doesn't specify whether or not Everett Fox thinks that means go back to the slave, like the flesh pots of slavery, or just your other obligations. Good. Barry, and then Tova, and then Sue.
Well, going back to the image that I had created, suggested earlier, Moshe and Aaron, they're not leaders. Pharaoh doesn't recognize them as leaders of the Israelite people. And in fact, we just learned that the leaders didn't come. They were afraid to come. Pharaoh's turning their back on them. But who are you two coming here? Why are you distracting? That's the translation I have. Why are you distracting the people from what they're supposed to be doing? He knows that Moshe and Aaron don't have the support of the people. He's throwing them back under the bus. Basically.
Yeah. So distracting is a good attempt. Unkelus translates as tivatlun, levatel, right? Why are you getting in the way? Why are you canceling them from their work? It's all we know what Pharaoh means. We're trying to figure out why that verb is being used, but we have a basic sense of what's going on.
Fundamentally, he's not recognizing Moshe and Aaron as representing anybody. So get out of here.
Yes, good. And I like what Lara and Diane just wrote. Moshe and Aaron are pharaohing the people, right? They're trying to take away the very pharaonic power that Pharaoh has, and the choice of verb is leading us in that direction. Good. Tova?
My hand was actually up from last time, but I do have a comment.
Oh, good.
Yes. What strikes me in the phrase of, I have the translation, go ye unto your burdens, is that it's a put down of Moses and Aaron. It's reducing them to the same level as these slaves that they're speaking on the behalf of, all the more pointed if we read into it the narrative of the story of Moses once having been part of the great house of the house of Pharaoh. So it's reducing their status. And I know I'm looking ahead to the next verse. I think it may hint a little bit at this underlying uneasiness that if you distract them from their burdens, what might they start thinking about doing? If you distract slaves from what you have put on them, what will they choose to do?
Yeah, great. I love that comment that it's Pharaoh not only not agreeing to the request, but putting these two diplomats back way down, right? And the last thing an enslaver wants to do, and my head is all in this since coming back from the South and some of the books I've been reading, the last thing an enslaver wants to do is to give any rope, any extra. You want it to be that koffel to be as taut and as tight as possible, because that's how you wield ultimate control and, frankly, increase your bottom line. It's pretty brutal. So not only am I not freeing those slaves, but guards seize them, right? We could read L'chu l'sivlotechem as Pharaoh saying, of the person who grew up in his home, guards sees them. It's not the only way to read it. Rashi specifically does not read it that way, but that you can't not consider that given the word l'sivlotechem. Sue, and then we'll look at Rashi.
Well, I was just thinking, I mean, I know Pharaoh's Peresh Ayin, but when we have Pharaoh and Tough for You and all that, I was thinking about Tiferet, and it's, although it's with an aleph, it feels kind of like, Pharaoh taking that word, taking the power of Tiferet. And
yeah, I think you're right that it's evocative on an auditory level, but not etymologically, because this is pei. It's not only that it's aleph versus ayin; it's a different place in the root. It's pei resh ayin versus pei aleph resh. But this is an oral tradition, so sometimes the sounds were interesting and evocative, even if it wasn't a linguistic connection. Particularly since we are thinking of the etymology of words much more than our ancestors were, right? They weren't like in the same way that we use English and we make unconscious associations without necessarily thinking through how the words are connected. So the people who were learning this material and receiving this material back then, their connections were more, I would think, instant and auditory than going deep into a dictionary to find out if the words had cognates with each other. Sue, why don't you were the one reading the verse, right? So you want to try the Rashi?
Sure. Tafriu et ha'am mimasav, that section. Tavdilu v'tarchiku otam mimlachtam, sheshomim lachem uspurim lanuach min amlacha.
Okay, period. So the first Rashi.
Period? I don't see a period.
I'm telling you.
That's okay. Thank you. Stop there. So, I was looking for punctuation. Believe me.
The first thing Rashi does is tell us where he weighs in on what the verb means. So
he thinks it means separate them. Separate them and remove them and add the distance between their work and them.
Good. So he's basically saying to Everett Fox 1,000 years later, I know that para, pei, resh, ayin can also mean like a let loose, a letting go, a wildness. That's not what it means here, right? Everett Fox says, let the people loose from their tasks. This is more of just distance, right? Not a release, but a distance. Tavdilu, right? The havdalah and tarchiku. Right. And shehem shomim lachem. What does that mean?
And they'll because if they listen to you, they're going to want to take a nap.
Yeah, like Pharaoh imputes to Moses and Aaron authority or a certain amount of weight to the Israelites. They're going to listen to you. Usfurim lanuach. They're going to prefer, believe it or not, they're going to prefer resting than doing my work, right? So why are you doing anything? 3 days? Like, we can even read this as Pharaoh accepting that the only thing that they're being asked to do is to go out for 3 days and come back. And Pharaoh's answer is, why are you doing anything to separate from their work? Because once they're separated from it, they're going to choose that, right? Or as Joel says, they're going to unionize, right? V'chein
Pra'ehu al ta'avor bo.
So I'm going to share some screens. We're going to look at some of these verses that Rashi is going to bring us to. Okay.
Pra'ehu al ta'avor bo racheku.
So we're in Mishlei, these short little witticisms. This is wisdom literature, little ideas to live by. Ba'orach Rishaim al tavo, do not go in the orach, the way of the wicked. This is one verse ahead. Va'al ta'asher b'derech ra'im. Interesting use of the root asher here. Because the only thing of asher is to be content, right? Ashrei yoshevetecha. But I think it means something different here. Do not follow or go in the pathway of the wicked. Pira'ehu al ta'avorbo, right? Distance yourself from it, right? Stay away from it, right? It's translated here as avoid it because the pra'ehu is written as if the word has a direct object. Avoid it. Don't go through it. Seteh, like sota, the woman who strays, stray from it, me'alav ba'avor, and let it go by. So Rashi brings this verse, and he says, what does pra'ehu al ta'avor bo mean? He puts in one Hebrew word.
Rachakehu.
Rachakehu, rachok, right? So here, reader, is one example of para, meaning to distance. V'chein.
V'chein. There's another v'chein? No, that same v'chein? V'chein pra'ehu al ta'avor bo oh no, the new one you want.
Yeah.
V'chein v'tifra'u kol atzati.
Good. So this is Proverbs 1, verse 25.
Kifaruhu in Shemot. Nirchak v'nitav. V'chein tifra'u, so like that, tifra'u kol atzati.
So look at the screen.
Separate all my yoets. Oh.
So this is from earlier on in the book of Proverbs. V'tifra'u chol atzati. Here it's spurned because again it's translated. I think this is a JPS translation. Yeah, JPS 1985, and spurn allows the second half of the phrase to be a direct object. But tifra'u chol atzati means you stayed away from, you distanced yourself from the very thing I counseled you. The tochachti, my rebuke, my constructive critique, lo avitem, you didn't pay attention to, right? So he gives us two places here where para does not mean the other main thing that para might mean, which is a letting loose, which is what however Fox translates it. And then he has one more. Go ahead. Kifaruahu. Okay, what is this scene? This is the golden calf. This is a really interesting scene. It's an interesting scene in macro, but it's a really interesting scene in micro, and we'll go slowly when we get there, 8 years from now. So this is Aaron explaining to Moshe. So it's interesting that the proof text here is the next time when Aaron and Moshe are going to be most divided. Here they're most united, right? They're united in their message to Pharaoh. And Rashi brings us a proof text, because the language works, but it's also interesting to a scene in which Aaron is doing the opposite of what God wants him to do. Va'omar lahem, I said to them, Lemi zahav, who's got gold? Hitparku, take it off. Vayitnu li, they gave it to me. Vashlicheu ba'esh, I put it in the fire, and look at that. I wasn't intending to do it. Vayetze egel hazeh, the calf came out, right? This is Pharaoh's version, Aaron's version of the cat ate my homework. I didn't do anything. All I do is throw gold into the fire. Out came a calf. Look at this verse. Vayar Moshe, Moses saw, et ha'am, the people, kifaruahu, they were out of control, wild. This is the use of Peresh Ayin that I think Everett Fox is translating. It's interesting that Rashi is using this as a proof text. I don't think it's a great proof text for the use of the root para, which means distance. And then I love these three Hebrew words, kifira'o aharon, which means grammatically, Aaron parad it, the nation. Aaron let them go. But what does it also say? Faro Aharon. Aaron became Pharaoh. It's just a great three Hebrew words, right? Particularly as Tova reminds us that the word Pharaoh may not be Hebrew, but you cannot read, particularly in a text without vowels, Ki Faro Aharon, and not think simultaneously that Aaron is para'ing the nation by letting it out of control, and that Aaron has become the very person from whom Aaron helped release the Israelites. Lishmitzak bakamehem. They became out of control. They were a menace to anyone who rose up against them. Okay, so Rashi quotes this, and we'll just finish. Rashi has two more words. I think Rashi would have been stronger to not quote this, because I don't think this use of para means distancing. But Rashi goes anyway. Kifaruahu. What did Rashi say?
Nirchas v'nitav.
Right, that
get away from that.
Yeah, that the nation was nirchak. They were distant, and nitav, like vile. They had maybe distanced themselves from the right way. Okay, Tova, and then I'll share with you another dictionary entry for this root.
Just to build on this seeming chiming of Pharaoh and the verb, in Egyptian, I was just checking the spelling because Egyptian was a Hamitic language, a cousin of Semitic, so they are related. And the actual spelling of Pharaoh it's pei resh basically, and then ayin. It is an ayin, the equivalent of the ayin in the Egyptian alphabet that's being used. So they are very closely related, and that would no doubt have resonated way back.
Yeah, great. That's really interesting. Let me share with you the BDB. So again, this is biblical Hebrew, not rabbinic Hebrew. On pei resh ayin. So first of all, it means long hair, and hair that's been basically allowed to let go. Para, to let go, to let alone, to unbind one hair, to uncover one's hair. And in the Hif'il, tafriu. So we have the exact jackpot, right? This is BDB quoting a verse. To cause to refrain, which I think is similar to how Rashi wants to read this verse, and not how Everett Fox does. That it's a Hif'il, it's a causative of para, and para means distance. So to distance something from, or to stop something from. It also means to shew lack of restraint. And then, of course, look at exactly what Tova was saying. Egyptian paro, great house of royal court. But different entries, because BDB knows that it's a borrowed word from another language that just ends up having a play in the Hebrew root. Okay. Comments, questions before we look at Lechu L'Sivlotechem. Barry.
It just rang back to me. One of the phrases you had read to previously was discipline. This is the opposite of discipline. The loss of that discipline that we should hold to.
Very good, right? And that goes closer to Everett Fox's translation, a letting loose, which I think is what Paro means in the golden calf scene, which is why I think it's strange that Rashi uses a proof text, right? A undoing of the very control that Pharaoh, have worked so hard to put in place, right? Enslavers work very hard to keep their slaves in place, right? So the last thing they want is for that to be let loose in any way. Good. Okay, we won't have time to finish this, but let's start the Lechu L'Sivlotechem, and maybe we'll get far enough to see what I was referring to before in terms of how Rashi understands what they're being sent to. Sue, you're still up?
I'm up. It's long. Okay. Lechu L'Sivlotechem. לכו למלאכתכם שיש לכם לעשות בבתיכם, אבל מלאכת שעבוד מצרים לא הייתה על שבטו של לוי. תדע לך שהרי משה ואהרון יוצאים. Oh, is that the next sentence? Is that the next thing? No.
Well, it's
part of this.
Part of it.
Okay.
Two more words. Yotzim uva'im.
There's more after that. Yotzim uva'im. Hein rabim atem. That's the end.
So I have two more words. I'm not looking at the Torah Chaim one. Yours ends at Yotzim.
At uva'im.
So my version of Rashi that I happen to be looking at right now is Yotzim uva'im shelo b'rashut.
Oh, I don't have that.
Okay, so...
you know what I have? I have a Sheen Chupchik Resh. So I didn't know what that meant. I left it out. What does it mean?
I'm looking at it. No. Are you reading from this one?
No, I'm reading from a different... I'm reading from... no.
Got it.
But it shows
my Silverman has a Shin and a Chupchik and a Resh. Yeah.
What does that mean?
Maybe it means Shelo Rashut. Maybe it's an acronym for, I don't know why that would be acronymized, but...
What does yours say? Yours is Shelo Rashut?
Shelo B'Rashut.
And what does that mean?
Without without permission. Shelo, without permission. So to translate.
It means Shemot Rabbah. That's what it's just quoting the source.
Right, of course. Thank you for that. All right, Sue.
Okay, I got to go back. Go back to your work that you have to do in your house, in your homes, in your houses.
Right? So he's weighing in.
He's sending them home.
Right, but intentionally Rashi saying not go back to your enslavement, go back to your regular household duties.
Okay. Aval malechet shiv'ud mitzrayim, but the work of your Egyptian work,
not just work. Shi'abud is enslavement. It's built from the word heved, but the work of the enslavement of Egypt.
Lo hayta shel shivto shel Levi. It wasn't for the tribe of Levi.
Rashi is going to make the claim that all of the Israelites were enslaved by Egypt except for the tribe of Levi, and Moshe and Aaron are both Levites. And how do we know this? B'tedalacha.
You should know, She'arei Moshe v'Aaron, that because Aaron and Moshe can come and go.
Shelo b'reshut, without permission, right? So right. Shemot Rabbah learns from this in a longer midrashic text that apparently the enslavement of the Israelites was not comprehensive, and not just that Moses and Aaron were allowed in because they were diplomats, but they were from a tribe that somehow escaped slavery, right? This is not pshat in the Torah, but it's a midrashic thrust. We don't see that at all really in the Haggadah. There's no sense that the only people who needed to be redeemed were the tribes other than Levi. But, it is interesting in this scene that Moshe and Aaron go in and out. They don't have to request permission. And so therefore Rashi reads it when Pharaoh says go back to your sivlot, it means go back to your, washing your dishes and tending to your tomato gardens. You're not my slaves. Larry Diane, with this we'll finish, and then I have a quick logistical announcement.
Yeah, two quick things. I'm perplexed just in terms of the text, because like you're looking at the Torah Chaim, which has Shelo b'rashut, but that doesn't appear in the Sefaria version of that. And then there is the footnote where in the Torah Chaim, which says it's from Shemot Rabbah. And I'm just wondering, is it possible this is a misunderstanding that the Shin Reish was meant to be Shemot Rabbah, and it was interpreted as being Shelo b'rashut or something like that?
It's interesting because even I made that mistake before Leonard properly corrected me, because I was trying to make sense of the Shin Reish that I didn't see. I thought maybe it's connected to that. And, we do have that in our tradition, right? That's the Magdil Migdol on Birkat HaMazor and Shabbat. The reason why that seems unlikely to me is because that seems to be something that would have been picked up by the editors of the Torah Chaim. Like it would have been a B'tfus Rishon Leita. It's not in the first printing. Like the scholars of the Rashi text would have pointed it out, but maybe they missed one. I don't know. It's possible.
And I'm sure that we'll have to pick this up next time. I'm struck by all the richness of the root saval or sovel, savlanut, lisbol, and sovelet can be tolerance. It can be burdens or oppressions. It can be all these different things that it can be.
Yeah. And I'm appreciative to what Sue said before, that in English we do have that connection when, like, to suffer and tolerate seem like different words, but insufferable and intolerable seem synonymous.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.